Welcome to the Vaping and E-Cigarette Information presentation. The following information was adapted from the Stanford Toolkit in a collaboration with Napa Valley Unified School District and Napa County Office of Education. This presentation serves as an education tool for students to inform them of the potential health risks of e-cigarettes and other vape devices in hopes that they will make safe and healthy decisions as they move through high school and into adulthood. First, we'll discuss what an e-cigarette is. So e-cigarettes are made up of a battery and an atomizer, or a coil, an absorbent material that absorbs the e-liquid and can contain anything from nicotine, propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, and flavorants, as well as other chemicals. The battery allows the atomizer to heat the liquid called e-juice, which creates an aerosol that is breathed into the lungs and breathed out into the air repeatedly. Some e-cigarettes allow users to fill them themselves using the e-liquid, while others come preloaded. Originally, e-cigarettes were designed to look like traditional cigarettes and were disposable. So what is the e-juice or e-liquid? E-juice or e-liquid contains several ingredients. The ones listed here are nicotine, propylene glycol, which you might recognize from smoke machines, vegetable glycerin, and flavoring chemicals. So the big question often asked about e-cigarettes or vape pens is that the e-liquid creates water vapor, just water vapor. Do you think that's correct? Well, unfortunately, it's not correct. It does not just create water vapor. However, it does create an aerosol. So what's an aerosol? An aerosol is not a vapor, to be clear, but what an e-pen does, or an e-cigarette does, is it allows the user to make large clouds that they may think are just water vapor, but in reality the cloud is a mixture of many different chemicals that were either present in the e-liquid before or produced during the heating process using that coil we showed you earlier. A vapor is a chemical that has evaporated. An aerosol is a mixture of liquid particles suspended in gas and can contain many chemicals. Instead of just mixing with the air like pure gas, aerosols leave drops behind. This point is illustrated in this painting by Mark Ternsey. The woman on the left is spraying an aerosol, which will leave residue on the mirror. The one on the right is smoking a cigarette, which will also leave residue on the mirror and on other items in the room. So many people ask, what's the difference between cigarette chemicals and e-cigarette chemicals? Surely e-cigarettes have less chemicals than traditional cigarettes. And while that's true, there are some similarities. So here's a list of chemicals that are found in cigarettes. We see some of the players we've already talked about, like propylene glycol, glycerin, and nicotine. Nicotine being the most addictive substance on planet Earth. So how many of these do you think are in e-cigarettes? If you were to take a guess right now, I want you to write on your paper, how many of these chemicals do you think show up in e-cigarettes? Well, we talked about propylene glycol, so that was one. Glycerin, flavorings, nicotine. And as you'll start to see, most of those chemicals listed on that last page also show up in e-cigarettes. In fact, all of these have been found in e-cigarette vape pen aerosol. Things like chromium, copper, arsenic. The FDA has found that many of these are carcinogenic, meaning they could be cancer causing. So where else might you find these chemicals we just talked about? Well, the first one's propylene glycol, and you might be familiar with that because it's found in antifreeze. For example, propylene glycol can be found in systems used to winterize plumbing systems so they don't break during the winter. The next is acetone, often known as nail polish remover. It's also found in paint thinner. Then we come to ethylbenzene. And ethylbenzene is often used to make other chemicals. It's also found in other products, including pesticides, synthetic rubber, varnishes, paints, and inks. Then we come to formaldehyde. Formaldehyde-based solutions are also used in embalming and to disinfect and temporarily preserve human and animal remains. If you think back to your biology class, that stuff that smelled awful when you were dissecting frogs, that's formaldehyde. Next, we'll talk about nicotine, which is perhaps the most important substance found in e-cigarettes. Nicotine is a drug that's highly addictive in moderate doses and is the reason why smokers may continue smoking even after they start getting sick. Of course, in high doses, it's actually a poison, and in fact, plants make it to keep insects from eating them as a protective factor. The last chemical we'll talk about is rubidium, and rubidium is found in fireworks. It's what creates their bright colors. So we're going to talk a little bit more about nicotine now and the importance of understanding nicotine amounts. In the recent past, e-liquid was federally unregulated and often mislabeled. When many of the juices were tested, some that claimed to have zero nicotine actually had nicotine. This means if you pick up a vape pen that says nicotine free, it might have had small traces of nicotine. And that's important because even in small amounts, nicotine can be addictive. Even amongst packages that labeled the amount of nicotine in the e-cigarette, they weren't always true. So just because they said it had a certain amount didn't mean it actually had that certain amount. We are now starting to see regulation on this. The FDA in August of 2016 began to regulate e-cigarettes and vape pens, but we still have a long ways to go as far as the labeling being accurate. A bit more about nicotine. What exactly is nicotine? Well, nicotine is a drug that's a stimulant, meaning it raises the level of physical or psychological activity in the body, and it's toxic at high doses. It's highly addictive because it causes changes in the brain chemistry quickly and leaves the brain craving more. Nicotine is found in tobacco products, and nicotine exposure during fetal development has lasting adverse consequences for brain development. Likewise, we see when youth use nicotine, there are also changes in brain development, and people who start using nicotine before the age of 21 may actually have a higher risk of becoming addicted to nicotine than those who start using after the age of 25. But if nicotine is so unsafe, why do you think people continue to use this product? It's probably because of how addictive nicotine is. It actually changes the way your brain works. So once you're exposed to nicotine, you keep craving it, and it can be very, very difficult to quit. So next we're going to talk about where you can find nicotine. So nicotine can be found in tobacco and comes from tobacco leaves. Nicotine is found in cigarettes, and tobacco companies made cigarettes more addictive by controlling and increasing the nicotine levels and by enhancing the impact of nicotine by adding chemicals. Most hookah contains nicotine and overall can have a lot of the same negative effects of cigarettes. The e-juice, which we spent a long time talking about, has nicotine in it as well. So all of these products contain nicotine. So I spoke about how nicotine works in the brain and causes more addiction. So the reaction that nicotine has in the brain results in the stimulation of pleasure centers in the brain when inhaled, and these are going to light up in yellow. When inhaled, nicotine enters into the brain after passing through the lungs, so it goes into your lungs, into your bloodstream, and then reaches the brain. It then binds to pleasure receptors in the brain that cause a release of pleasure chemicals such as dopamine, providing the user with a temporary feeling of pleasure. Now, this may not sound dangerous, but in reality, the nicotine interferes with the body's natural ability to experience and communicate pleasure. Nicotine use creates floods of dopamine and intense feelings. The pleasure centers in the brain adapt to the drug use by sensing the extra dopamine and then begin to produce less of it. This means that the user has a hard time creating the natural feelings of pleasure without using nicotine. The user needs the nicotine just to feel normal again. Additionally, the pleasure centers in the brain create a memory of nicotine and an appetite for it. The appetite for nicotine, even despite its harmful consequences, is what we refer to as nicotine addiction. So to put it another way, you smoke a cigarette or an e-cigarette and the nicotine binds to these receptors in your brain, and your brain says, oh, I like that. And instead of making dopamine naturally, it uses the nicotine to get that feeling of pleasure. But nicotine is dangerous, dopamine is not, and that's a problem. Next, we're going to talk about the cycle of nicotine addiction. Nicotine is highly addictive, as we talked about previously, and what that basically means is the human brain can develop such a strong dependence on the drug that the nicotine user can no longer control their desire or smoking behaviors. The cycle of nicotine addiction starts with bringing nicotine into the body. In this case, and in this example, it comes from the inhalation of cigarettes, hookah, or e-cigarettes and or vapes. Nicotine enters the brain and activates the pleasure centers of the brain, shown here. After that, the level of the nicotine in the body drops quickly. This drop in nicotine levels causes the body to have a strong craving for nicotine that is satisfied by bringing more nicotine into the body. The cycle is powered by the body's biological reaction to nicotine and isn't controlled by the person vaping. So you just continue to want the nicotine to replace that feeling of pleasure, and your brain no longer creates dopamine the way it's supposed to. So based on this information, I want you just to take a moment and think about what you would say to someone who says they won't let themselves get addicted to nicotine. So we talked about nicotine in the brain. Now we're going to get more specific and talk about nicotine and the effects on the body. So it can also have an effect all over your body. For example, using nicotine can also make your heart beat faster because it can activate your fight or flight response. Nicotine can independently cause trouble breathing and damage your lungs outside of all the chemicals and toxins in cigarettes. Nicotine can cause you to have increased acid reflux, or also known as heartburn. Also, it can cause insulin resistance, making it potentially more dangerous for those with diabetes. Nicotine can negatively impact your reproductive organs as well. Also, one last note is that in heavy smokers, we see an increased risk of bladder cancer, and it's directly linked to nicotine. So we're going to take a moment now and move away from talking about specifically about nicotine and focus on the flavors of e-cigarettes and the health hazards posed by these different flavors. Currently, there are over 7,000 flavors of e-cigarettes, and that's one of the major appeals of this product, is that there's so many different flavors. It was a very successful marketing strategy that allows e-cigarette users to consume nicotine without the harsh taste of cigarettes. To compare, traditional cigarettes are only allowed to come in traditional flavors and menthol, and the reason that that is the case is across the U.S. we passed laws to not have flavored tobacco because it appealed to young people, kids, and teenagers, and we saw that they were getting addicted to cigarettes earlier because of these flavors. And it may come as a surprise to many people, but the flavors themselves pose a risk in the e-cigarettes. Some flavors have been shown to be toxic due to the chemicals they contain, and they contain a lot of chemicals, as we'll see in a moment. E-cigarettes contain cytotoxic flavors. What's important to note about these flavors is that the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, has only approved them for ingestion, not inhalation. So the route of administration, as we say, matters. So they've looked at these colorants and flavorants to see how someone, when they swallow it, affects their body, but not what happens when it's inhaled through the lungs. And remember, stomach acid is one of the strongest acids on planet Earth, so it might be able to handle these flavorants and colorants, but it doesn't seem like our lungs can. So for sure, the cinnamon flavor may contain these various chemicals, and the cherry flavor contains benzaldehyde, which has some toxicity. Because of these flavorants, likely, we are seeing people develop something called popcorn lung. So popcorn lung is named because in Indiana there were cases where the workers in the Oroville popcorn factory were developing the scarring of the lungs. And what we think happened is diacetyl and closely related compound pentadione cause this popcorn lung, also known as constructive bronchiolitis obliterans. It's irreversible and it's in the respiratory system, and it was again named after these factory workers who inhaled the artificial butter while working, causing the small airways in the lungs to become irreversibly scarred and constricted, impairing breathing. And we've only looked at this for about 5 years, so we know that it's permanent scarring, but we don't know how it might continue to affect them as they move through life. The problem is that diacetyl, this compound that causes popcorn lung, has been found in many e-liquids, especially with the sweet flavorants. So in addition to popcorn lung, there are other health risks to e-cigarette and vape pen users. Based on current information, we know that there are health risks when people use these products in the lungs. The aerosols produced by the chemicals in the e-juice enter into the user's lung and leave a chemical residue behind. Also, many e-cigarette vape pens have nicotine, which is known to have effect on the cardiovascular system as well as the urinary tract. Ear, eye, and throat irritation is common among e-cigarette and vape pen users, and perhaps most worrisome is the possibility of more young people developing an addiction to nicotine, and that can be a lifelong addiction. Nicotine use in early adolescence causes changes in the brain, as we talked about, that could potentially cause lifelong e-cigarette users. So what are some of the long-term health effects of e-cigarettes? Well, the short answer is we really don't have enough time to have studied the long-term health effects, but the little amount of time we do have, it doesn't look promising. To give you a reference, we've had 25 plus years to study the effects of traditional tobacco on people's health. However, e-cigarettes have only been on the market since about beginning of 2013. So we've only had 5 years to study the health effects. But what we are beginning to see is that there might be long-term effects on the cardiovascular system, such as affecting heart disease. Again, nicotine and its addictive properties will contribute to long-term use, especially in young people. That's a major concern. But the take-home message of this slide is that this is only the beginning of revealing the health risks associated with long-term e-cigarette use. So most people don't want to be guinea pigs in a study, but current e-cigarette users are the guinea pigs for researchers on the long-term health effects of e-cigarettes. So now we're going to talk about inhalation versus ingestion in a bit more detail. I spoke about it earlier, but I wanted to go into more detail with this slide. So again, there is a difference between ingesting and inhaling, and it's important to understand that inhaling doesn't involve a breakdown of chemicals as seen with ingestion. As shown in this graphic, ingestion involves consuming a solid through the mouth and having the digestive tract break down these chemicals. However, unlike ingestion, anything inhaled into the lungs is not broken down. Imagine all the chemicals from vape aerosol clogging up the lungs with no breakdown occurring. The lungs were not built like the stomach. Again, the stomach has a strong acid. There are chemicals that have been approved by the government for ingestion but not for inhalation. Yet e-cigarette vape companies, like the creators of JUUL, state that certain chemicals are safe for inhaling. One of those is propylene glycol. Propylene glycol is a chemical commonly found in e-liquid. The government has approved this chemical for ingestion, not for inhalation. Propylene glycol is not approved for inhaling, even though it's one of the most common ingredients in the e-juice. So now we're going to talk about other health effects of e-cigarettes, particularly how the device itself can be harmful. So e-cigarettes can explode, and incidents of e-cigarette explosions have skyrocketed over the past 8 years. So we're going to watch this CNN video that shows some examples of this occurring in real time, along with the amount of reported incidences.
The City Advantage Platinum Select card is designed with
Can't vape on the bus, man.
Seconds after this Fresno, California bus passenger places his e-cigarette in his pocket, it explodes, severely burning him. The battery was likely the cause.
They have a wrap on the outside that needs to stay intact. If that battery gets torn and that starts to touch metal or something like loose change in your pocket or something like that, it can definitely short out the battery.
Explosions like these have caused serious injuries before. Surveillance cameras captured the terrifying moment in November when an e-cigarette exploded inside a New York City man's pocket, causing third-degree burns. And earlier this month, a 24-year-old was severely burned when a pair of e-cigarette batteries exploded in his pocket. Attorney Sanford Rubenstein represents both men.
It explodes multiple times over and over like fireworks. There should be a ban on the possession of e-cigarettes and e-cigarette batteries until such time as the manufacturers determine what's causing them to explode.
Between 2009 and January 2016, there were 134 incidents of overheating, fire, or explosion involving e-cigarettes in the United States. More than 50 people were injured. Just days before the latest incident, incoming Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called for more federal oversight.
It's time to take a hard look at requiring a recall of certain brands if they are much more likely to explode than others.
The concern is, as e-cigarettes become even more popular, the number of people injured will grow too.
So we talked about the health effects, we've talked about the addictive properties of nicotine. Let's talk about why e-cigarettes are being pushed so much by the tobacco companies. Well, one thing is that adolescents who vaped were 4 times more likely to report cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking is at the lowest it's been since cigarettes hit the market, and so these tobacco companies are looking for ways to get people addicted. E-cigarettes may be the bridge that introduces non-users to tobacco cigarettes. In a recent study, again, they found that adolescents who were first-time e-cigarette users were 4 times more likely to report e-cigarette smoking in just 1 year. It is a major concern among health professionals that using e-cigarettes, vape pens, at a young age can lead to use of traditional cigarettes down the road. So now that we've spent some time talking about the health effects, we're going to move on and talk about the JUULpod specifically. So the JUULpod has become very popular in the last few years, and like the e-cigarette, it has some specific health concerns. So based on what we know about e-cigarette juice or liquid, which chemicals do you think are in the e-juice of the JUULpod? Think back to ones that we're concerned about with e-cigarettes. Well, if you thought nicotine, you'd be right. The first ingredient is nicotine, one of the most addictive compounds on planet Earth. And benzoic acid is also part of this nicotine to make a nicotine salt that makes the JUUL more like smoking a traditional cigarette. Then there's glycerol and propylene glycol. And again, those are very common in e-liquid juices, and they are not approved for inhaling. The others include natural oils, extracts, and flavors. What does this mean exactly? What else is in this? Well, we don't know. They just say natural oils. So there is no definitive answer on what these natural oils are, and they have not been studied for inhalation again. But what we do know is that there are over 20 million JUULs being sold a month in the United States, and that they now make up 30% of the total e-cigarette sales in the US. But we are nowhere close to understanding what's in the JUULpod and how it affects the adolescent body. However, millions of devices are being sold, and the company is making a profit from exposing youth to all of these chemicals. So how many known and unknown chemicals do you think are being released from these 20 million JUULs that are being sold each month? Probably a lot. The take-home message here is we want to avoid using products that haven't been tested, and we especially want to avoid nicotine and benzoic acid and propylene glycol, as we talked about before, all of which are in the JUUL, but we could be exposing ourselves to other harsh chemicals and not even knowing it by using this JUUL product. So I spoke about propylene glycol and nicotine quite a bit, but what I didn't talk about was benzoic acid, and this is a chemical diagram of what benzoic acid looks like, and it's specific to the JUULpod because it helps make it into a salt, which is how the pod works. So the reason we're concerned about benzoic acid is one of the chemicals in the JUUL that we should be worried about, since the long-term effects of heating and aerosolizing this are unknown. Inhaling benzoic acid alone can irritate the nose, lungs, and throat. As a result, symptoms such as coughing, wheezing, and shortness of breath can occur. If exposed to the skin repeatedly, it can lead to cracking and drying. It is worth knowing that there is limited research on the long-term effects of benzoic acid exposure. We need to study the health consequences this has on youth and adults, along with all chemicals associated with e-cigarettes that use nicotine salts, because we have no science on this information to say what it does to our bodies. Okay, we're going to wrap up here shortly with some last things to consider about e-cigarettes, JUULs, and e-liquid. The first of those is that the FDA does not currently regulate the chemical ingredients and labels. Although they're beginning to regulate the things that are in e-liquid and in the JUUL salt, it's not as regulated as, say, traditional cigarettes or any other food or drug product. In fact, the FDA also does not regulate the amount of different chemicals that can be used to make the e-liquid, nor the cleanliness of the facilities that produce the e-liquid. So while we have limited evidence on the long-term outcomes of e-cigarettes, and we know some of the chemicals that are in there, and we know that they have effects on their body, there could be a host of other chemicals that are also in the e-liquid that we don't even know we're being exposed to, or other toxins from uncleanly facilities where these are being made. So these are just some things to consider about e-cigarettes and JUULs. Another thing to consider about e-cigarettes is the e-cigarette industry itself. So the tobacco company and e-cigarette companies have a formula for what to do when they lose a smoker due to smoking-related illness, and that's create replacement smokers. So for every one smoker the e-cigarette and tobacco industry loses to smoking-related illness, they want to replace that with to new smokers. And who do they target for new smokers? Young people your age. So the e-cigarette and vape pen industry sees young people as the perfect replacement customer. They know if young people get hooked to their products early in life, because nicotine is so addictive, they'll have them as customers for years to come. So if you start smoking at 18, they probably have a customer for about 40 years. That's a lot of money for them. It's well known by health professionals and the e-cigarette tobacco industry alike that many current smokers started smoking before adulthood. So about 80% of adult smokers started before the age of 18. So if you take a closer look at the e-cigarette vape pen marketing, you'll notice that the industry's attempts to make e-cigarettes and vape pens trendy and appealing to youth. This is why many of them are colorful, why they have flavors like Jolly Rancher and Unicorn Vomit. It's completely a marketing ploy to advertise to young people like you. Speaking of advertising, the cigarette industry spends $88.1 million to figure out how to market towards you. They spend about $1 million an hour on advertising to get the attention of people they would like to buy their product. E-cigarette companies are no different than tobacco companies, and they spend about the same amount of money. So that's a lot of money for advertising. Why do you think companies are willing to spend so much money on advertising? To addict young people like you to nicotine, aka replacement smokers. They spend all this money, $1 million an hour, because they make triple that in sales from people addicted to nicotine. So for the last slide, we just want to quickly cover some takeaways. The biggest takeaway is that you should avoid using any nicotine products, and this includes e-cigarettes, vapes, JUULs, traditional tobacco, snuff, or chewing tobacco. For the last time, nicotine is the most addictive substance on planet Earth. Because of that, when people start using these in their early years, they're more likely to have trouble with addiction of nicotine later in life, and it can be more difficult for them to quit. We also don't know what the chemicals in e-cigarettes do to our body, but the little evidence we do have shows it's probably not healthy. Remember, the choices we make in our teens can affect our health for the rest of our lives. This can be for both positive and negative health choices. So the example I like to use is if I start an exercise regime like running in my teens and I continue that into adulthood as part of a healthy lifestyle, I'm more likely to have good healthy habits when it comes to exercise. The reverse, if I start using something like e-cigarettes as a teen, I'm more likely to use that as an adult and continue using in adulthood, which could have long-lasting negative health impacts. Remember, traditional cigarettes are the leading cause of preventable death in the United States. So if e-cigarettes lead to more traditional cigarettes, we're only making a problem worse, and we want you to be able to make safe and healthy decisions both now and into adulthood. For more information about e-cigarettes, visit stillblowingsmoke.org or feel free to reach out to your administrator or teachers for more information.